The Wyoming wind howled like a banshee across the Morrison ranch, driving snow so thick that Jake could barely see the barn from his kitchen window. February of 1882 had brought the worst blizzard in memory, and for 3 days now, he and his 8-year-old daughter Lucy had been trapped inside their modest log cabin, watching their woodpile dwindle and their supplies run low. "Daddy, when will the snow stop?" Lucy asked, pressing her small face against the frost-covered glass. Her breath fogged the window as she peered into the white void beyond. Jake Morrison, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, looked up from the ledger, where he'd been calculating their remaining feed for the cattle. At 42, his face bore the lines of a man who'd lost his wife to fever 2 winters past and had been raising his daughter alone ever since. "Soon as the good Lord sees fit, little one. Weather like this don't ask permission." The cabin shuddered under another violent gust, and Jake instinctively glanced at the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, a man learned to be prepared for anything. Bears, wolves, rustlers, they all posed threats, but none quite like the merciless cold that could kill a person in minutes. Lucy had returned to her wooden blocks, building elaborate frontier towns that inevitably got knocked down by imaginary outlaws. "Tell me about Mama again," she said without looking up, her voice barely audible above the storm. Jake's heart clenched, as it always did when she asked. "Your Mama was the prettiest lady in all of Cheyenne," he began, settling into the familiar cadence of memory. "Hair like spun gold, and she could sing like an angel. Made the best apple pie this side of the Mississippi, too. And she would have loved me." Lucy's question carried the weight of a child who had never known her mother's embrace. "She did love you, sweetheart. Every day she carried you, she'd talk to you, tell you stories about the ranch, about the horses we'd teach you to ride." Jake's voice grew thick. "She picked your name because it means light, and you were going to be the light of our lives." A sudden crash outside made them both freeze. It wasn't the sound of falling timber or a collapsing barn. It was something else, something that didn't belong to the storm's natural symphony. Jake rose slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun belt. "Lucy, get away from the window." "But Daddy!" "Now, Lucy." She obeyed without question, her small body pressing against the stone hearth. Jake crept to the window, wiping away the condensation with his sleeve. The snow was so thick he could barely make out shapes, but there, movement near the corral fence, something dark against the endless white. Another crash, followed by what sounded almost like crying. "Daddy, that baby's cold," Lucy suddenly exclaimed, pointing toward the window. Jake squinted harder into the blizzard. At first he saw nothing but swirling snow and the dark outline of fence posts. Then, like a mirage materializing from the white void, he saw her, a figure in tattered clothing stumbling through knee-deep drifts, clutching something against her chest. The woman, for it was clearly a woman, fell forward into the snow, struggled to rise, then collapsed again. Even through the howling wind, Jake could hear the thin wail of an infant. Without hesitation, he grabbed his heavy coat and hat from the peg by the door. "Lucy, stoke that fire high and get some blankets ready. We got company coming." "Is it the baby I saw, Daddy?" "Yes, darling, and it looks like they need our help real bad." Jake threw open the cabin door and was immediately hit by a wall of freezing air that stole his breath. The cold cut through his clothes like knives, but he pushed forward, his boots sinking deep into the snow with each step. The wind was so fierce it nearly knocked him sideways, but he pressed on toward the fallen figure. When he reached her, Jake's heart nearly broke. The woman was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with long black hair matted with ice and snow. Her skin was pale with cold, her lips blue, and she was barely conscious. Wrapped in her arms, protected by what looked like the remains of a woolen shawl, was a tiny baby, couldn't be more than 6 months old. Ma'am, can you hear me?" Jake shouted over the wind, but she didn't respond. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing dark brown irises filled with desperate fear before they closed again. The baby, however, was very much awake and very unhappy about his circumstances. His cries were weak but persistent, and Jake could see the child's lips were turning the dangerous blue-white color of frostbite. There was no time for questions or hesitation. Jake scooped both mother and child into his arms, surprised by how light the woman was. Too light, as if she hadn't eaten properly in weeks. He turned back toward the cabin, fighting against the wind that seemed determined to push him back into the wilderness. Each step was a battle. The snow grabbed at his boots, the wind tried to tear his burden from his arms, and the cold bit at every exposed inch of skin. But Jake Morrison had been forged by this harsh land, and he would not let it claim 2 more lives on his watch. The cabin door had never looked so welcoming. Lucy had it open before he reached the porch, her small face etched with concern and curiosity. "Help me get them by the fire," Jake commanded, carrying his unconscious guests inside. The warmth of the cabin was a blessed relief, but he knew they weren't out of danger yet. Hypothermia was a killer, and both the woman and her baby showed dangerous signs. As Jake gently laid the woman on the rug before the fireplace, Lucy approached with an armload of blankets. "Daddy, is she going to be okay?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but we're sure going to try." Jake began peeling away the woman's frozen outer garments, revealing a simple brown dress beneath, the kind a working woman might wear, now torn and stained with travel. "Get me some warm water, not hot, just warm. And see if we got any of that beef broth left from yesterday." The baby had quieted somewhat in the warmth, but Jake could see he was still dangerously cold. With gentle hands, he unwrapped the infant from his makeshift coverings, checking for signs of frostbite. The little boy, for he could see now it was a boy, had dark hair like his mother and the same brown eyes, though they were currently filled with confusion and discomfort rather than fear. "Hello there, little fella," Jake whispered, wrapping the child in one of Lucy's old baby blankets. "You're safe now. You and your mama both." The woman stirred, her lips moving though no sound came out. Jake leaned closer, trying to catch her words. "Por favor, mi niño," she whispered, her accent revealing her Mexican heritage. Jake's Spanish was limited to what he'd picked up trading with vaqueros over the years, but he understood enough. She was begging for her son's safety. "He's safe, ma'am, you both are. You're in my home now, and ain't nobody gonna hurt you here." He spoke slowly, hoping she could understand through her delirium. Her eyes opened fully for the first time, dark and beautiful, but filled with a fear that went deeper than the cold. When she saw Jake's face, the face of an Anglo stranger, that fear intensified, and she tried to sit up, reaching desperately for her child. "Easy now. Easy," Jake said, carefully placing the baby in her arms. "Nobody's going to take him from you. I got a little girl myself, I understand." The woman clutched her son to her chest, her eyes darting between Jake and Lucy, who was returning with the warm water and broth. Jake could see the internal struggle playing out on her face, gratitude for being saved warring with the deep distrust that experience had likely taught her. "What's your name, Mom?" Jake asked gently. She hesitated for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read his intentions. Finally, in heavily accented English, she whispered, "Maria, Maria Delgado, and this is Carlos." "Well, Maria Delgado, I'm Jake Morrison, and this here's my daughter Lucy. Welcome to our home." Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, but inside the Morrison cabin, 3 strangers had become something more, survivors bound together by the storm's unexpected gift of human connection. The second morning brought no relief from the blizzard, but it did bring consciousness back to Maria Delgado. Jake woke to the sound of hushed Spanish prayers and found her sitting up near the dying fire, nursing baby Carlos, while studying every corner of the cabin with wary eyes. "Morning, Mom," Jake said softly, not wanting to startle her. She flinched anyway, pulling her son closer to her chest. The dress Lucy had found for her, one of his late wife Sarah's, hung loose on her small frame, making her look even more fragile in the morning light. "Senor Morrison," she replied carefully, her accent thick with exhaustion. Thank you. For my son." Jake noticed she didn't thank him for herself, a small detail that spoke volumes about her pride and her pain. "You hungry? I got some cornbread and bacon. Coffee too, though it ain't much to speak of." Maria shook her head quickly. "We cannot stay. The storm, when it stops—" "Storm ain't stopping any time soon," Jake interrupted gently. "And even if it did, you got nowhere to go in this cold with that baby. Not safely anyway." Her dark eyes flashed with something between fear and defiance. "You do not understand. People like me, we bring trouble. Better we go." "People like you." Jake poured himself coffee from the pot, keeping his voice deliberately casual. "How you mean mothers trying to keep their children alive?" Before Maria could respond, Lucy bounded down from the loft where she slept, her blonde hair messy from sleep and her eyes bright with curiosity. "Is the baby awake? Can I see him?" Maria instinctively turned away, shielding Carlos from view. The gesture was small but unmistakable, and Jake saw the hurt that flashed across Lucy's innocent face. "Lucy, why don't you help me with breakfast?" Jake suggested, steering his daughter toward the kitchen area. In a lower voice, he added, "Give the lady some space, sweetheart. She's been through something terrible." As they prepared a simple meal, Jake watched Maria from the corner of his eye. She was studying everything: the location of his rifle, the distance to the door, the thickness of the walls. Her survival instincts were sharp, honed by experiences he could only imagine. "Daddy," Lucy whispered as she helped slice the cornbread, "why is she scared of us? We saved her." Jake paused, trying to find words an 8-year-old could understand. Sometimes when people get hurt bad, they forget that not everyone wants to hurt them. She's protecting her baby the only way she knows how. Like how you protect me. Exactly like that, little one. When they sat down to eat, the tension was thick as the snow outside. Maria accepted a small piece of cornbread, but refused anything more despite Jake's gentle insistence. Baby Carlos fussed intermittently, and each cry made his mother's shoulders tense as if expecting criticism or anger. "He's teething," Maria explained apologetically during one particularly vocal episode. "The cold, it makes worse." "Lucy was the same way," Jake offered. "Kept us up for weeks. Sarah, my wife, she used to rub whiskey on her gums. Worked like a charm." Maria's eyes widened with alarm. "Whiskey? For a baby?" "Just a little bit on the finger," Jake clarified quickly, realizing how it sounded. "Not to drink, just to numb the gums." The suggestion seemed to horrify Maria even more, and Jake realized he'd stumbled into cultural territory he didn't understand. In her mind, he might as well have suggested poisoning her child. "We have other ways," she said stiffly. "In my pueblo, the curanderas know plants." "Ain't no plants growing in this weather," Jake pointed out practically. "And no curanderas neither. Sometimes you got to make do with what you have." "You do not understand." Maria's voice carried a sharp edge now. "In Texas, I see what happens to Mexican babies when Anglo doctors help. They die more than they live." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jake felt his own defenses rising. He'd been nothing but kind to her and her child, but then he saw the pain behind her anger. This wasn't about him. This was about a history of hurt he couldn't even begin to fathom. "You're from Texas?" he asked instead. Maria nodded reluctantly. "Near San Antonio. My husband, he worked cattle for Anglo Rancher. Good man, my Carlos. Never steal, never drink too much. But when the drought come and cattle die..." She trailed off, her hands trembling slightly. "What happened to him?" "They say he steal water for our animals. Say Mexican workers take too much, leave nothing for Patron's cattle." Maria's voice grew distant, lost in painful memory. "Carlos," he tried to explain, "our goats, they very small, drink very little. But they no listen. They say example must be made." Jake felt a cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "Maria, they hang him from the big oak by the river," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Make all the Mexican families watch, including me, including other children." Her arms tightened around baby Carlos as if the memory could somehow reach forward and snatch him away. Lucy had stopped eating, her young face grave with an understanding that transcended her years. On the frontier, children learned about death and injustice earlier than they should. "So you ran," Jake said quietly. "See, that night, I take Carlos and few things, start walking north. People say maybe Colorado, maybe Wyoming has work for Mexican woman. But the snow." She gestured helplessly at the window where the blizzard continued its assault. "You walked from Texas with a baby. Sometimes ride with traders, sometimes walk. Always hungry, always cold. But better than staying where they kill my husband for being Mexican and thirsty." The simple way she said it, the matter-of-fact acceptance of such brutal injustice, made Jake's chest tighten with anger. Not at her, but at the world that had driven a young mother to flee into a Wyoming blizzard with nothing but the clothes on her back. "Well, you're here now," he said finally. "And you're safe." Maria's laugh was bitter. "Safe, Senor Morrison? You are a kind man, but I am not stupid. Your neighbors, when they see Mexican woman in your house, what they think, what they say in town." Jake opened his mouth to protest, then closed it, because she was right. Folks in these parts weren't known for their tolerance, especially toward Mexicans. The memory of the Alamo and the Mexican War still burned bright in many minds, fed by stories and prejudices passed down like family heirlooms. "Let me worry about the neighbors," he said. "And when they come with ropes like they did to my Carlos?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Outside, the wind continued to howl, trapping them all together in a space that suddenly felt much smaller than before. Lucy, who had been listening with the intensity only children possessed, suddenly spoke up. "Daddy wouldn't let anyone hurt you or baby Carlos. He's the strongest man in Wyoming." Maria looked at the little girl for a long moment, and for the first time since awakening, her expression softened slightly. "You are fortunate, Nina, to have Papa who protects." "Your Papa didn't protect you?" Lucy asked with heartbreaking innocence. "My Papa died when I am small," Maria replied simply. "Very different life." Jake saw an opportunity and took it. "Lucy, why don't you show Mrs. Delgado how you take care of your doll? Maybe she'd like to see." As his daughter scampered off to retrieve her treasured rag doll, Jake leaned forward slightly. "Maria, I know you got no reason to trust me. I know what my people done to yours. Not me personally, but my people. But I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that not all of us are cut from the same cloth. And if you are wrong, if your neighbors come, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But right now, there's a blizzard outside that'll kill you and your boy in minutes. Inside there's warmth and food and people who want to help. Seems like an easy choice to me." Maria studied his face for a long moment, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why help strangers, especially Mexican strangers?" Jake thought about it, really considered the question. "I reckon because my little girl saw you both freezing to death, and her first thought wasn't about your skin color or your accent. It was that a baby was cold and needed help. Sometimes it takes a child to remind us what being human really means." For the first time since he'd carried her from the snow, Maria's guard dropped just a fraction. "She is good child. She is. And she's going to want to help take care of young Carlos, whether you like it or not. Might as well get used to it." Despite everything, Maria's mouth quirked up in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the Morrison cabin, the first fragile threads of trust were beginning to form. By the third day, the blizzard had finally begun to exhaust itself, though snow continued to fall in thick, lazy flakes that added to the already impressive drifts surrounding the Morrison cabin. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the howling wind had diminished to occasional gusts that no longer threatened to tear the roof clean off. Maria had begun to venture beyond the immediate area around the fireplace, though she still moved through the cabin like a wild animal ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. She helped with small tasks, washing dishes, folding clothes, but always kept baby Carlos within arm's reach and her eyes on the nearest exit. Lucy, meanwhile, had appointed herself as the infant's unofficial guardian and entertainment committee. "Look, Carlos," she whispered, dangling a small wooden horse above the baby's makeshift crib, a drawer lined with blankets. "This is Thunder. He's the fastest horse in all of Wyoming." Carlos, now warm and well-fed, gurgled happily and reached for the toy with chubby fingers. The sound of his laughter filled the cabin with something it had been missing since Sarah's death, the joy of a truly innocent soul. "He likes it," Maria observed, a genuine smile crossing her face for the first time since her arrival. She was sitting nearby, mending a tear in Lucy's dress with surprising skill. "Course he does," Lucy declared with 8-year-old authority. "All babies like horses. Daddy says I rode before I could walk proper." "Your mama, she not worry?" Maria asked. Lucy's expression grew solemn. "Mama's in heaven with the angels. She died when I was 6, but Daddy says she watches over us." Maria's hands stilled on the sewing. "I am sorry, Nina, is very hard, no, Mama." "Sometimes," Lucy admitted, "but Daddy takes real good care of me. And now we can take care of you and Carlos, too." The simple declaration seemed to catch Maria off guard. She looked up from her sewing to find Jake watching from the kitchen area, where he was preparing their midday meal. "Lucy's got a big heart," he said quietly, "sometimes bigger than her common sense." "Is good thing," Maria replied, then quickly looked back down at her work as if surprised by her own openness. Jake had been thinking about their situation all morning. The storm was clearing, which meant soon they'd need to make decisions about the future. He'd also been watching Maria carefully, noting things she probably didn't realize she was revealing. The way she automatically sorted items into neat piles, the practiced efficiency with which she moved around a kitchen, the careful way she examined the quality of his tools and supplies. "You worked in a big house before," he said, making it a statement rather than a question. Maria's hands froze. "Why you say this? The way you fold clothes, arrange things, that's not something you learn keeping house for just yourself." For a moment, Jake thought she wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, she nodded. "In San Antonio, before I marry Carlos, I work for Anglo family, the Harrisons. They have big ranch, many servants. I clean, help in kitchen. They treat you well." Maria's laugh held no humor. "Senora Harrison, she like Mexican girls because we work cheap and no complain. She teach me English, but only so I understand orders better. When guests come, we must stay out of sight. Don't want to upset the ladies with too much color, she say. Jake felt that familiar anger rising again. But you learned. See, I learned many things. How to read little bit. How to speak so people understand. How to make myself invisible when need be. She met his eyes directly. Very useful skills for Mexican woman. What made you leave to marry Carlos? This time, Maria's smile was real and sad at the same time. He see me in town market, buying vegetables for Harrison kitchen. He say I too beautiful to spend life making other people's beds. He asked me to make life with him instead. Sounds like a good man. The best, Maria whispered, her voice thick with grief. He work very hard, never drink too much like other vaqueros. He want to save money, maybe have small ranch someday. He say our children will have better life than we have. Lucy had been listening intently while continuing to entertain baby Carlos. What's a vaquero? Mexican cowboy, Jake explained. They've been working cattle longer than any of us. Carlos's papa was a cowboy. Lucy's eyes went wide. That's wonderful, just like you, Daddy. The innocence of the connection, seeing no difference between an Anglo rancher and a Mexican vaquero, seemed to touch something deep in Maria. She reached over and gently touched Lucy's blonde hair. Your papa is good man too, I think, she said softly. The best, Lucy echoed Maria's earlier words, making both adults smile. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself studying his unexpected guests more closely. Maria moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to hard work, but there was something else, a natural grace that no amount of hardship had been able to steal. When she thought no one was watching, she would hum softly to Carlos, little Spanish lullabies that filled the cabin with warmth. And Carlos himself was proving to be a remarkably good-natured baby, despite everything he'd endured. He rarely fussed unless he was hungry or needed changing, and he seemed fascinated by Lucy's constant chatter and attention. Maria, Jake said during a quiet moment when Lucy was napping and Carlos was dozing in his mother's arms. Can I ask you something? She tensed slightly but nodded. When the storm clears completely, what's your plan? Where were you heading? North, she said simply. People say maybe Denver, maybe Cheyenne. Somewhere there is work for woman alone. What kind of work? Maria's cheeks colored slightly. Cleaning, cooking, washing clothes, what I know how to do. Jake chose his next words carefully. That's a hard life for a woman alone with a baby. Sigh, but his life, better than death. What if, Jake paused, knowing he was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. What if there was another choice? Maria's eyes sharpened with suspicion. What choice? Stay here, work for me. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Maria stared at him, as if he'd suggested she sprout wings and fly. Here, she whispered. With you? I need help, Jake said honestly. House is falling apart since Sarah died. Lucy needs, well, she needs a woman's touch sometimes. And come spring there'll be cattle work, branding, all sorts of things that go easier with an extra pair of hands. And your neighbors, when they see Mexican woman living in your house. Jake had been thinking about that too. They'll talk, sure enough, but they'll talk no matter what. At least this way, you and Carlos got a roof over your heads and regular meals. You think I cannot work hard because I am woman? Mom, anybody who walked from Texas to Wyoming with a baby in her arms ain't afraid of hard work. I just think maybe it's time somebody gave you a chance to work for yourself instead of just surviving day to day. Maria was quiet for a long time, rocking Carlos gently while she considered. And Lucy? What'd she think about Mexican woman in her mama's house? Lucy would be thrilled, Jake said honestly. She's been wanting a baby brother or sister since she could talk, and she's already half in love with Carlos. But I am not her mama. No, Jake agreed, but you could be her friend, and maybe she could be yours. As if summoned by their conversation, Lucy stirred from her nap and padded over to where they sat. Without hesitation, she climbed onto the bench next to Maria and peered down at the sleeping baby. Is Carlos dreaming about horses? She asked in a whisper. Maybe, Maria replied, automatically adjusting her hold so Lucy could see better. What you dream about, Nina? Lots of things. Sometimes I dream about Mama. Sometimes about having a big family with lots of babies to play with. Lucy looked up at Maria with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. Do you dream about Carlos's papa? Si, sometimes. Do you think he'd want Carlos to be safe and warm and happy? Of course, Mika. Then you should stay with us, Lucy declared, with the absolute certainty of childhood. Because Daddy makes everyone safe, and I can teach Carlos everything about horses and cattle and how to be a proper cowboy. Maria looked at Jake over Lucy's head, and he saw something shift in her expression. The walls she'd built around herself were still there, but maybe, just maybe, they weren't quite as high as they'd been 3 days ago. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but gentler now. Not the punishing assault of the blizzard, but the soft, steady snowfall of winter settling in to stay. Inside the Morrison cabin, 3 lost souls and 1 determined little girl were beginning to discover that sometimes the most unlikely families were the strongest ones of all. The 4th day brought clear skies and bitter cold that made the air itself seem to crackle. Jake woke before dawn to check on the livestock, bundling himself in every piece of warm clothing he owned before stepping into a world transformed by the storm. Snow lay in drifts 8 feet high in some places, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes that sparkled like diamonds in the early morning light. His cattle had weathered the storm better than he'd hoped, huddled together in the shelter he'd built on the lee side of the barn. The horses nickered softly when they saw him, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. Everything was still and peaceful, almost magical in its pristine beauty. But Jake knew that beauty was deceptive. The storm had been the worst in memory, and if he'd lost cattle or equipment, it could mean the difference between making it through the winter and losing everything he'd worked to build. When he returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots and blowing on his frozen fingers, he found Maria already awake and tending the fire. She'd managed to coax the embers back to crackling life and had coffee brewing, real coffee, not the chicory substitute he'd been rationing. "You used the good coffee," he observed, not accusingly but with surprise. Maria's cheeks colored. "I find it while looking for... I think maybe after storm, we need real coffee. I replace when I can." "No need to replace anything," Jake assured her. "Just surprised you found it. I had it hidden pretty good." "Mexican women, we learn to find things," Maria said with the hint of a smile. "Especially coffee." Lucy was still sleeping in the loft, and baby Carlos dozed peacefully in his makeshift crib. The cabin felt warm and lived in a way it hadn't since Sarah's death, and Jake realized how much he'd missed the simple pleasure of coming home to a tended fire and the smell of breakfast cooking. "Storm's over," he said, accepting the cup of coffee Maria offered him. "See, I see. Very beautiful outside, but very cold. Road'll be impassable for days, maybe weeks. Even after the snow melts some, the mud'll be terrible." Jake watched Maria's face carefully as he said this, looking for some sign of how she felt about being trapped here longer. Relief? Disappointment? But her expression remained carefully neutral. "You have lost animals?" she asked instead. "Don't think so. Got to do a proper count when it warms up some, but they look all right from what I could see." "Is good. Carlos, my husband, he always say winter is when you learn if you prepared right." The mention of her dead husband brought a familiar sadness to her eyes, but it was a gentler sadness now, tempered by growing acceptance. Jake was beginning to understand that Maria's grief wasn't just for Carlos the man, but for the future they'd planned together, a future that had died with him on that oak tree by the river. "Maria," Jake said carefully, "about what I said yesterday, about staying on to work. You don't have to answer right now, but I think about it," she interrupted quietly. "All night, I think. And is very generous offer, but you do not understand what it mean having Mexican woman in your house. People will say things. Let them say what they want. Easy words when you not hear them yet." Maria's voice carried the weight of experience. "When they call your daughter half-breed because she play with Mexican baby. When they say you become Mexicano lover because you kind to widow. When Senora Harrison at General Store refuse to sell you supplies because you keep Mexican servants." Jake felt his jaw clench. "Sarah Harrison? From the store in town? You know her? She's the one you worked for in San Antonio?" Maria nodded. "Her husband. He died 2 years ago. She come here to live with her brother, own half the businesses in your town now." The information hit Jake like a physical blow. Sarah Harrison, if it was the same woman, was indeed one of the most influential people in their small community. She owned the general store, the boarding house, and had significant interest in the bank. If she recognized Maria and chose to make trouble, that changes things, Jake admitted. "See, now you see." "No, you don't understand. It changes things because now I know exactly what kind of person we're dealing with, and it makes me want to help you even more." Maria looked at him as if he'd announced his intention to wrestle a grizzly bear bare-handed. "You cannot fight whole town for Mexican strangers. Watch me." The simple declaration, spoken without boasting or bravado, seemed to surprise Maria more than any grand gesture might have. She studied Jake's face, looking for signs that this was mere masculine posturing, but found only quiet determination. "Why?" she asked, the same question she'd posed before. "Why fight for people you barely know?" Jake was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain something he wasn't entirely sure he understood himself. "You know what I see when I look at you and Carlos? Mexican refugees who bring trouble. No, I see a woman who walked hundreds of miles through hostile territory to keep her child safe. I see a baby who laughs when Lucy makes funny faces, who doesn't care what color her skin is or what language she speaks. I see people who make my daughter smile in ways she hasn't since her mama died." Jake paused, then continued more quietly. "And I see what this country could be if we stopped being so damn afraid of anybody who looks or sounds different from us." "Pretty words," Maria said, but her voice lacked its usual edge. "But words no stop bullets. Words no stop ropes." "No, but good people with guns and determination can stop both those things." Before Maria could respond, Lucy came scrambling down from the loft, her hair tousled and her face bright with excitement. "Daddy, the storm stopped. Can we go outside and play in the snow?" "After breakfast and chores," Jake promised. "And after you get properly dressed. It's colder than a witch's." He caught himself. "It's very cold out there." "Can Carlos come play too?" Lucy asked, peering into the baby's crib where he was just beginning to stir. "Carlos is too little for snow," Maria said gently. "But maybe he can watch from window while you play." "I'll build him the best snowman in all Wyoming," Lucy declared, "with rocks for eyes and a carrot nose and everything." As they prepared breakfast together, a process that had already developed its own rhythm over the past few days, Jake found himself studying the domestic scene with growing amazement. Maria moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, anticipating needs and solving small problems without being asked. Lucy chatted constantly to baby Carlos, who seemed to find her endless commentary on frontier life absolutely fascinating. It felt like a family, not the same as what he'd had with Sarah, but something new and different and surprisingly right. After breakfast, Jake bundled up again to do a more thorough check of his property, while Lucy played in the snow under Maria's watchful eye from the cabin window. The damage from the storm was less than he'd feared. A few fence rails down, some missing shingles from the barn roof, but nothing that couldn't be repaired come spring. More importantly, he'd lost only 2 head of cattle, both old animals that might not have survived the winter anyway. It was, all things considered, a small miracle. When he returned to the cabin, he found Lucy building her promised snowman, while Maria stood in the doorway, holding Carlos and pointing out various features of the construction project to him in a mixture of Spanish and English. "Very good snowman," Maria called out to Lucy. "Carlos, he think is very handsome." "Does he really?" Lucy asked breathlessly, pausing in her work to wave at the baby. "See, look how he smile." And Carlos was indeed smiling, his chubby cheeks red with cold from the open door, but his eyes bright with interest. He babbled something that sounded almost like words, making Lucy giggle with delight. "He's trying to talk," she exclaimed. "What's he saying?" He say Lucy make very good hermana mea," Maria replied, her voice warm with affection. "What's that mean?" "Big sister." The words hung in the air like a promise, and Jake saw something shift in Maria's expression, a softening, a letting down of defenses that she might not even have realized were there. That evening, as they sat around the fire after dinner, Maria finally gave her answer. "I stay," she said simply. "For now I stay and work, but if trouble come, we'll face it together," Jake said firmly. "Together," Lucy echoed, looking up from where she was playing with Carlos on a blanket near the hearth. "Together," Maria repeated softly, as if testing the word in a new language. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the pines, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a promise of spring to come, of new beginnings, and of the possibility that sometimes the most unlikely families could become the strongest ones of all. 6 weeks later, the spring thaw had transformed the Wyoming landscape from a pristine white wilderness into a muddy, bustling tableau of new life. The snow had retreated to patches in the shadowed places, wildflowers were beginning to push through the warming earth, and Jake's cattle were growing fat on the new grass. Maria had proven to be everything Jake had hoped for and more. She'd thrown herself into ranch work with a determination that impressed even him, mending clothes with skill that surpassed his late wife's, cooking meals that made Lucy declare her the best cook in all the territories, and showing an intuitive understanding of cattle that came from years of watching her husband work. Baby Carlos, now 8 months old, had grown strong and healthy. He could sit up on his own, babbled constantly in what sounded like a mixture of Spanish and English, and had completely captured Lucy's heart. She'd taken to calling him her little brother, a title that made Maria smile every time she heard it. But Jake knew their peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. Eventually they'd need supplies from town, and when that day came, their carefully constructed bubble of contentment would face its first real test. That day arrived on a warm April morning, when Jake discovered their coffee had finally run out. "We could do without," Maria suggested, when Jake announced the need for a supply run. "Is not necessary." "Speak for yourself," Jake replied with a grin. "I need my morning coffee, and you make the best I've ever tasted. Besides, we need other things too. Flour, sugar, ammunition. Can't put it off forever." Maria's face had gone pale at the mention of town. "Maybe I stay here with Carlos. Lucy too, better that way." "No," Jake said firmly. "We're a family now, and families stick together. Besides, Lucy's been wanting to show Carlos off to everyone, haven't you, sweetheart?" Lucy, who was feeding Carlos mashed vegetables with more enthusiasm than skill, looked up with bright eyes. "Oh yes, Mrs. Patterson's never seen a baby as smart as Carlos." "Lucy," Maria began, but Jake held up a hand. "It's time," he said gently. "We can't hide forever, and I won't have you feeling like you need to." The ride to town was tense despite the beautiful spring weather. Maria sat rigidly beside Jake on the wagon seat, holding Carlos tightly, while Lucy chattered excitedly from the back. Jake had made sure his rifle was loaded and within easy reach, not because he expected trouble, but because on the frontier it was better to be prepared. The town of Clearwater had grown some since Jake's last visit in the fall. There were new buildings going up, more people on the streets, and an air of prosperity that came with the railroad's recent arrival. But Jake also noticed the way conversations stopped when their wagon rolled down Main Street, the way eyes followed them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. At the general store, Sarah Harrison stood behind the counter like a queen holding court. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, with steel-grey hair pulled back severely and cold blue eyes that missed nothing. Jake had never particularly liked her, but he'd tolerated her because she ran an honest business and kept her opinions to herself. The moment Maria stepped through the door, however, Sarah's expression changed dramatically. "Well, well," she said in a voice that could have frozen the spring flowers. "If it isn't little Maria from San Antonio. Still getting yourself into situations above your station, I see." Maria's grip on Carlos tightened, but she kept her voice level. "Senora Harrison." "It's Mrs. Harrison," the older woman corrected sharply. "And I must say, I'm surprised to see you here. I heard terrible things happened in Texas. Tragic, really, how some people bring trouble on themselves." Jake felt his temper flare. "Mrs. Harrison, I'd like to purchase some supplies." "Of course, Mr. Morrison. Though I have to say I'm curious about your domestic arrangements." Her gaze flicked meaningfully toward Maria and Carlos. "My domestic arrangements are my own business," Jake replied coolly. "Naturally, but you know how people talk, especially when there are unusual circumstances involved." Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. "Maria, dear, I do hope you're not filling Mr. Morrison's head with any of your sob stories. We both know how you Mexican girls can be when you want something." "Senora Mrs. Harrison," Maria said quietly, "I work for Senor Morrison, nothing more." "Oh, I'm sure that's what you call it." Sarah's laugh was like ice cracking. "Just like you worked for that cattle thief husband of yours." The words hung in the air like a slap. Jake saw Maria flinch as if she'd been physically struck, saw the color drain from her face. But before he could respond, Lucy stepped forward with all the righteous indignation an 8-year-old could muster. "Carlos's papa wasn't a thief," she declared loudly. "He was a good man who got killed by bad people, and Maria and baby Carlos are part of our family now." "Lucy," Jake began, but his daughter was just getting started. "And Maria makes the best biscuits in Wyoming, and she teaches me Spanish words, and Carlos is the smartest baby ever. He's going to be a cowboy just like his papa and my daddy." The entire store had gone silent. Other customers had stopped their shopping to stare at the unfolding drama. Sarah Harrison's face had turned an interesting shade of purple, while Maria looked like she wanted to disappear into the floorboards. "Well," Sarah said finally, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "how touching. I do hope you won't live to regret your charitable impulses, Mr. Morrison." "The only thing I regret," Jake said, picking up Lucy and settling her on his hip while keeping his voice perfectly calm, "is not coming to town sooner to show off my new family." The word family hit the room like a thunderclap. Jake saw shock, disapproval and calculation flash across various faces, but he also saw something else in the eyes of Tom Patterson, the blacksmith, and his wife Ellen, something that might have been approval. "So you'll find," Jake continued, addressing the room in general, "that Maria Delgado is one of the finest women you'll ever have the pleasure to meet, and if anyone has a problem with that, they're welcome to discuss it with me directly." The threat was politely worded but unmistakable. Jake Morrison might be a quiet man, but everyone in Clearwater knew he was handy with both fists and firearms, and that he didn't back down from a fight. "Now then," Jake said, turning back to Sarah with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "about those supplies." The transaction that followed was conducted in icy silence. Sarah filled their order with mechanical efficiency, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. When she quoted the total, Jake noticed it was significantly higher than usual, but he paid without comment. As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, Ellen Patterson approached with a warm smile. "Maria, isn't it?" she said kindly. "I'm Ellen Patterson. This must be your little one. What a beautiful baby." Carlos, sensing the friendliness in her voice, rewarded her with one of his brightest smiles and a happy babble that made Ellen laugh with delight. "He's wonderful," Ellen continued, "and Lucy's told me so much about him. She's quite the little mother, isn't she?" "Lucy is very good with Carlos," Maria replied carefully, still wary, but beginning to relax slightly. "You must bring him to church on Sunday," Ellen said. "The ladies would love to meet him, and we're always happy to welcome new families to our congregation." It was a simple invitation, but Jake understood its significance. Ellen Patterson was essentially offering to sponsor Maria's acceptance into the community, a generous gesture that wouldn't go unnoticed. "We'd like that very much," Jake said before Maria could object. As they prepared to leave town, Jake noticed that not all the attention they'd received had been hostile. Several people had nodded politely, and more than one person had stopped to admire Carlos or compliment Lucy on her obvious devotion to the baby. But he also noticed the group of men gathered outside the saloon, watching them with expressions that ranged from disapproval to outright hostility. One of them, a surly rancher named Buck Garrett who'd never liked Jake anyway, spat in the dirt as their wagon passed. "This ain't over, Morrison," Garrett called out. "You'll see." Jake didn't respond, but his hand moved closer to his rifle. Beside him, Maria had gone pale again, her earlier tentative optimism replaced by familiar fear. "It's all right," Jake said quietly as they left town behind. "Most folks are decent once they get to know you. And the ones who are not decent? We'll handle them when the time comes." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table in the warm glow of the oil lamps, Lucy regaled them with her version of the day's events, complete with dramatic reenactments of Sarah Harrison's mean face and enthusiastic descriptions of all the people who had admired Carlos. "And Mrs. Patterson said I could teach her little girl some Spanish words," Lucy announced. "She wants to know how to say beautiful baby so she can tell Carlos next time." "Bebe hermoso," Maria said automatically, then smiled at Lucy's serious attempt to repeat it. "Bebe hermoso," Lucy tried, making Carlos laugh at her pronunciation. "Close enough," Jake said, grinning. "You're getting good at this Spanish business." As they prepared for bed that night, Jake found Maria standing on the porch, looking out at the star-filled sky. Carlos was sleeping peacefully in her arms, and she was humming one of the soft Spanish lullabies that had become a familiar sound in the Morrison household. "Regrets?" Jake asked quietly, joining her at the porch rail. "Some," Maria admitted, "but also hope. Mrs. Patterson, she seemed very kind. Ellen's good people. So are most folks in Clearwater, once you get past the initial suspicion. And Sarah Harrison? She'll come around or she won't. Either way, we'll manage." Maria was quiet for a moment, then said, "Jake, what you said today about family, you mean this?" "Every word. Even when people make trouble?" "Especially then." Maria nodded slowly, then surprised him by reaching over and squeezing his hand briefly. "Gracias," she said simply, "for everything." As spring settled fully over the Wyoming territory, the Morrison Ranch buzzed with new life and new hope. There would be challenges ahead. Jake knew that as surely as he knew his own name. Some people would never accept Maria and Carlos as legitimate members of the community, and there would likely be those who would try to cause real trouble. But standing there on his porch, watching the woman who had become so much more than just a hired hand sing quietly to the baby who had brought joy back to his daughter's eyes, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Complete and utter certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the people who belonged with him. The snow had melted, spring had come, and the Morrison family, unconventional as it might be, was ready to face whatever the future might bring, together.